In the spring of 2023, a bald eagle nest was confirmed on a rooftop infrastructure unit in downtown Chicago. Not in a park bordering the city, not in a greenway corridor adjacent to the lakefront. On a building, inside the city, surrounded on all sides by the full density of a major American metropolis. Traffic below, glass towers adjacent. The river running through the canyon of the financial district less than a mile away. The birds were photographed, shared extensively on social media, celebrated in local news coverage as a heartwarming symbol of nature's resilience, and described by commentators across the ideological spectrum as proof that conservation works, that the bald eagle's recovery from near extinction represents one of America's great environmental success stories, and that the future of wildlife in urban America is brighter than we might have imagined. Every one of those things is true, and none of them is the most important thing about what is actually happening. If you find yourself wanting to understand what is genuinely going on with bald eagles in American cities right now, and why the scientists who study raptor ecology and urban wildlife dynamics are using words like unprecedented and anomalous and outside the expected parameters, you need to stay with this for the full duration. Because the story being told in the popular press about urban bald eagles is not wrong, exactly. It is incomplete in ways that matter. And the part that is missing is not a footnote, it is the actual story. The bald eagle's return from the edge of extinction is one of the most documented and genuinely remarkable conservation outcomes in the history of wildlife management in the United States. By the early 1960s, the contiguous United States held fewer than 500 nesting pairs of bald eagles, down from a population that numbered in the hundreds of thousands when European colonization began. The causes of the collapse were multiple and compounding. Direct killing was the first and most sustained cause. Bald eagles were legally shot, trapped, and poisoned for more than 3 centuries by farmers, fishermen, and ranchers who viewed them as competitors for fish and as threats to livestock, perceptions that were largely inaccurate, but that translated into systematic lethal persecution across the species range. Alaska paid a bounty on bald eagles until 1952. More than 128,000 were killed under that bounty program alone. The contiguous states offered their own bounties and protections for killing at various points throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The cumulative toll of directed killing alone was staggering. Then DDT was introduced as an agricultural insecticide following World War II, and the collapse accelerated in ways that were not understood until researchers began connecting the chemical's persistence in aquatic food chains with the catastrophic reproductive failures being documented in eagle populations across the country. DDT itself did not kill eagles in significant numbers. Its breakdown product, DDE, accumulated in the fatty tissues of fish, the eagle's primary food source, and when female eagles processed those tissues, the DDE interfered with calcium metabolism in a way that caused them to produce eggshells that were too thin to support the weight of an incubating adult. Eggs cracked, embryos died, nests that should have produced young produced nothing. A population that could survive substantial adult mortality through reproduction had its reproduction functionally destroyed across large portions of its range within a single decade of widespread DDT use. The decline was so rapid and so severe that some ornithologists in the late 1960s believed the species would not survive in the contiguous United States at all. The recovery that followed represents the convergence of several policy interventions that are now taught as the canonical model of raptor conservation. DDT was banned for agricultural use in the United States in 1972. The Bald Eagle Protection Act, originally passed in 1940 and strengthened subsequently, imposed federal penalties on the killing, possession, or harassment of bald eagles. The Endangered Species Act, passed in 1973, provided a legal and funding framework for active recovery efforts, including captive breeding, nest monitoring, and habitat protection. Hacking programs, in which captive-raised eaglets were placed in artificial nest platforms in suitable habitat and conditioned to hunt and survive without parental instruction, re-established the species in areas where it had been extirpated. Reintroductions in states like New York, Georgia, and Tennessee restored populations that had been functionally eliminated. By the time the bald eagle was removed from the federal endangered species list in 2007, the nesting pair count in the contiguous United States had risen from fewer than 500 to more than 9,000. The most recent estimates, published in 2021, put the total bald eagle population in the United States, including Alaska, at approximately 316,000 individuals. The species had not merely recovered, it had recovered at a scale and pace that exceeded the projections of most of the scientists who designed the recovery programs. That recovery is real. That recovery is worth celebrating. That recovery is also producing something that those recovery programs did not design for, and that the ecological models underpinning them did not fully anticipate, which is a population of bald eagles large enough and behaviorally flexible enough to begin colonizing environments that no bald eagle in recorded history had colonized before. The specific environment in question is the American city. To understand why this is significant, in ways that go beyond the heartwarming framing of urban wildlife photography, you need to understand what bald eagles are, ecologically, and what they have historically required in order to exist. Bald eagles are apex aquatic predators. Their ecology is organized around large bodies of water, specifically rivers, lakes, reservoirs, estuaries, and coastal waters that support abundant fish populations. Their nesting requirements, as documented across their historical range, are almost uniformly associated with large, old-growth, or mature forest trees within a specific distance of water, isolated enough from human disturbance to allow incubation and chick rearing without the flush and abandon response that human approach triggers in nesting raptors. The literature on bald eagle nest site selection prior to the 1990s consistently identifies three conditions as essentially necessary: proximity to productive water, large trees capable of supporting the multi-hundred-pound nests that eagles build and expand over decades, and buffer distance from intensive human activity. The buffer distance was not a minor preference. It was documented as a hard behavioral constraint. Studies conducted in the 1970s and 1980s found that nesting pairs consistently abandoned nest sites exposed to regular human activity within a radius that varied by region but was rarely less than several hundred meters from roads, structures, or regular human foot traffic. The term used in the literature was human disturbance tolerance, and bald eagles were characterized as having low to moderate tolerance at best, a trait that reinforced the species' dependence on remote, or at least lightly developed habitat. What is happening in American cities right now represents a departure from that documented behavioral baseline that is difficult to overstate. Bald eagles are not just appearing in cities occasionally as transients or dispersing juveniles exploring unfamiliar terrain. They are nesting there. They are raising young there. They are establishing site fidelity, meaning they are returning to the same urban and peri-urban locations year after year, defending territories and producing successful fledglings in environments that contain every element that the historical literature identifies as incompatible with successful eagle reproduction. Traffic noise at decibel levels that exceed the ambient sound of any natural environment the species has historically occupied. Human pedestrian activity at densities that would have caused nest abandonment in any eagle population studied before the 1990s. building mounted nest platforms that substitute for old-growth trees in environments where no old-growth trees exist. Artificial lighting that alters the photoperiod cues that regulate reproductive timing. And food sources that are not the clean, abundant river fish that Eagle ecology textbooks describe as the dietary foundation of the species. That last point, the food source question, is where the scientific discussion becomes most direct in its challenge to the celebratory narrative. What are bald eagles eating in Chicago, in Washington, D.C., in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, in Pittsburgh, in the other major American cities where nesting or near-nesting behavior has been documented in the past decade? The answer varies by location, but the data that has been collected through prey remains analysis at urban and peri-urban nest sites, through stable isotope studies of feathers from urban area eagles, and through direct observation of foraging behavior documented by researchers and by the extensive camera infrastructure that monitors urban wildlife, paints a picture of dietary flexibility that is both ecologically remarkable and ecologically concerning. Urban bald eagles are eating fish. This is consistent with their historical diet, and it is the benign end of the dietary story. Rivers running through or adjacent to major American cities, including the Potomac, the Delaware, the James, the Susquehanna, and the Chicago River system, have been recovering from the industrial pollution that rendered them essentially lifeless for much of the 20th century. And that recovery has restored fish populations that provide a real and substantial food base for eagles colonizing urban watersheds. The fish story is the one that fits the conservation success narrative cleanly, and it is genuinely part of what is enabling urban eagle colonization. Clean water legislation, combined with the reduction of point-source industrial discharge over several decades, has made American urban rivers more ecologically productive than they have been at any point since the early 19th century. Bald eagles, as dietary generalists capable of pursuing live fish, stealing from other birds, and scavenging dead fish along shorelines, are positioned to exploit that recovery more readily than many other large predator species. But urban bald eagles are also eating things that are not fish. They are eating American coots, Canada geese, mallard ducks, and other water birds that concentrate in urban water bodies in numbers that reflect those birds' own adaptation to human-dominated environments. They are eating gray squirrels, cottontail rabbits, and other urban mammals. They are eating road-killed deer, raccoons, opossums, and other carrion that the road network in and around American cities produces in extraordinary abundance. And in a subset of documented cases that has attracted the most scientific attention and the most careful language from researchers who are clearly aware of the political sensitivity of what they are reporting, they are eating domestic animals, cats, small dogs, backyard poultry. In urban and peri-urban areas where human-habituated eagles have established territories, the prey remains record at nest sites includes items that were not part of the historical diet of the species and that represent a form of prey switching with implications that parallel, in important ways, the prey switching documented in habituating mountain lion populations in the American West. The comparison to mountain lion habituation is not rhetorical. It is mechanistic. The behavioral process by which a bald eagle loses its wariness of human activity extends its foraging behavior into increasingly human-proximate environments, and begins taking prey that its less habituated counterparts would not have recognized as accessible, operates through the same neurological and experiential substrate as habituation in mammalian predators. The stimulus-response association between human presence and threat or danger erodes through repeated exposure without negative consequence. The foraging range of a habituating eagle expands into areas of human activity that it would previously have avoided. The prey recognition template, which in a wild-conditioned eagle is organized primarily around fish and water birds in natural settings, expands to incorporate the prey species that are abundant in human-dominated terrain. The process is not rapid. It develops over the lifetime of an individual bird and is strongly influenced by what the bird learned during the critical developmental period when it was acquiring its understanding of the world, either from parents in a wild setting or, in the case of hacked birds released through recovery programs, in the absence of wild-conditioned parental behavioral templates. This developmental dimension is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of what is currently happening with urban eagle populations, and it requires a brief but important detour into eagle behavioral ecology before its significance can be fully appreciated. Bald eagles, like most long-lived raptor species, are not born with fixed behavioral templates for prey selection, foraging location, and human avoidance. These behaviors are partly genetic in their broad outlines, but are substantially shaped by early experience. An eaglet raised by parents who are foraging in a wild, remote watershed, eating predominantly fish caught from clear rivers far from human development, is building a behavioral template organized around that environment and those prey. An eaglet raised in an urban or peri-urban nest site, watching parents forage in a river running between apartment buildings, taking road-killed mammals from highway shoulders, and navigating the full complexity of human-dominated terrain without ever experiencing negative consequences from human proximity, is building a fundamentally different behavioral template. That difference is not merely academic. It is the mechanism by which urban eagle populations self-perpetuate and reinforce the behavioral adaptations that make urban living possible for the species. The first generation of urban nesters faced the behavioral challenge of adapting to an unfamiliar environment. The young they raise in that environment are being conditioned from the earliest developmental period to treat it as normal. Each successive generation of urban-raised eagles is better adapted, behaviorally, to urban conditions than the generation before it. This process is what ecologists call behavioral niche expansion through cultural transmission, and it is one of the most powerful mechanisms of rapid ecological change available to long-lived, behaviorally flexible species. It does not require genetic change. It does not operate on evolutionary timescales. It operates on generational timescales in species with significant parental investment in offspring learning, which bald eagles, with their 18-month to 2-year developmental periods and intensive nest site parental behavior, exemplify to an unusual degree. The cultural transmission of urban foraging behavior from parent eagles to offspring eagles means that once urban nesting becomes established in a location and produces successful fledglings, the probability that those fledglings will themselves attempt to establish in urban or peri-urban environments is significantly elevated relative to what you would predict from the baseline population. Urban eagle behavior is not just spreading because more eagles are moving into cities. It is spreading because eagles raised in cities are producing more urban eagles, who are producing more urban eagles in a self-reinforcing cycle that the standard population dynamics models for the species were not built to capture. The scientists who are most direct about the implications of this process are not the ones appearing in local news segments celebrating urban eagle sightings. They are the ones publishing in journals like Biological Conservation, Urban Ecosystems, and the Orc, in papers whose titles tend toward the carefully neutral, but whose conclusions tend toward the quietly alarmed. The specific concern they articulate is not that bald eagles in cities will immediately or dramatically harm people. The species is not a predator of adult humans in any meaningful sense, and framing it that way would be as misleading as the purely celebratory framing it would be meant to replace. The concern is more structural and more interesting than that. It is about what urban eagle colonization reveals about the assumptions underlying the species' recovery management, about the ecological consequences of a large apex predator adapting to urban environments in ways that were not planned for and are not fully understood, and about the specific and identifiable human safety and ecological integrity risks that the current trend, if it continues at its present rate, will produce at scales that are not currently being addressed in the management frameworks governing the species. The human safety dimension deserves to be stated directly because the popular coverage has been so uniformly positive that the risks involved in sharing urban space with a large apex raptor have been essentially unacknowledged. Bald eagles are large birds, very large. Adult females, which are larger than males in the size dimorphic pattern common to raptors, can weigh up to 14 pounds with a wingspan approaching 8 feet. Their talons, the primary killing tool, are built to penetrate and grip with enough force to subdue adult Canada geese and fish in the 20-pound range. The gripping strength of a large bald eagle's talons has been measured at over 400 pounds per square inch in some studies, a figure that is difficult to contextualize, but that represents substantially more force than most human hands can generate, and far more than the integument of a human child or a domestic animal can easily resist. Eagles are not ambush predators of the kind that mountain lions represent, and they do not conduct the deliberate stalking behavior associated with feline predators. But they are capable of striking with speed and with force that is not intuitively apparent from watching them soar at altitude, and the documented record of eagle strikes on humans, while not long, is not empty. The incidents that are documented tend to cluster around nest defense rather than predatory behavior. Bald eagles defending active nest sites with eggs or chicks are among the most aggressively territorial animals in North American wildlife, and the intensity of defensive strikes directed at perceived threats to the nest can cause serious injuries. Researchers banding nestlings have been struck with enough force to require medical attention. Hikers approaching nest trees have been struck from behind with no warning. Joggers passing too close to active nest sites in riparian corridors have been struck on the head and face. The injury profile from eagle defensive strikes, when they connect cleanly, includes lacerations from talons, blunt impact trauma from the leading edge of wings, and in some cases, puncture wounds significant enough to require suturing. The incidents are not common. They have not produced fatalities in recent recorded history in the United States. They are also not so rare that their complete absence from the public conversation about urban eagle colonization represents an accurate accounting of the risk landscape. The risk profile changes in a specific and quantifiable way when you introduce eagle nest sites into densely populated human environments, where the spatial separation between active nests and human activity is measured in feet rather than hundreds of meters. A nest site on a highway bridge over an urban river, which is a documented configuration in multiple American cities, is a nest site where the minimum distance between incubating adults and passing human beings is determined by the height of the bridge structure rather than by any behavioral buffer of the kind that historically characterized the species' nest site selection. An eagle defending a bridge nest from a boat passing underneath it is an eagle making a threat assessment calculation at distances and human densities that its evolutionary history and its species' ecological literature did not prepare anyone to predict. The scientific literature on urban raptor nest defense is not extensive, precisely because urban nesting by the most territorial and largest North American raptor species has not, until very recently, been common enough to generate a substantial data set. That literature is now being built, in real time, by the urban eagle colonization that is occurring in advance of the management frameworks needed to address it. The domestic animal dimension of the story is the one most likely to generate the kind of sustained public attention that would translate into policy response, and it is also the one on which the available data is least systematic and most contested. The anecdotal record of bald eagles taking cats, small dogs, and backyard chickens in suburban and peri-urban areas is extensive and geographically widespread. The forums and community social media platforms of virtually every American metropolitan area with a documented eagle presence include recurring posts from residents describing the loss of pets to what they believe were eagle attacks. The documented record, meaning incidents verified through physical evidence, witness accounts, or photographic or video documentation, is smaller but not negligible. Eagles have been photographed and video recorded striking domestic cats in suburban yards in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Eagle involvement in the deaths of small dogs has been verified in multiple states by wildlife officials, examining carcasses and wound patterns consistent with talon strikes. The taking of backyard poultry in peri-urban areas adjacent to eagle territories has been documented extensively enough that it appears in wildlife management advisories issued by state agencies in at least a dozen states. What is not well documented, because the systematic monitoring infrastructure to capture it does not exist, is the rate at which these incidents are occurring and the degree to which they are increasing as urban eagle populations grow. The anecdotal record is growing. It would be growing even if the per capita rate of incidents was stable, simply because more eagles in more areas means more potential interactions. Whether the rate itself is increasing, whether individual urban adapted eagles are taking domestic animals at rates that exceed what would be expected from opportunistic encounters, is a question that the current monitoring infrastructure is not equipped to answer. This is a data gap with real consequences, because the answer to that question determines whether urban eagle colonization is producing a new and significant predation pressure on urban domestic animals, or whether it is producing an increase in incidence that is essentially proportional to the population growth and range expansion of the species. The difference between those two possibilities matters enormously for how the management response should be structured. The ecological dimension of urban eagle colonization extends well beyond the human safety and domestic animal questions, into territory that is, in some ways, more consequential and more difficult to communicate. Bald eagles are apex predators in aquatic ecosystems. Their ecological role in natural settings is well characterized. They suppress the populations of certain fish and waterbird species. They regulate the behavior of prey species in ways that produce cascading effects on community composition and ecosystem function. They are the visible expression of a web of trophic relationships that extend from the water chemistry at the base of aquatic food chains to the foraging behavior of other predators who must account for eagle presence in their own territory use and behavioral patterns. Introduce this apex predator into an urban ecosystem that has been developing its own community composition and trophic structure in the absence of a native apex avian predator, and you are introducing a disruptive force whose downstream ecological consequences are not predictable from the existing literature on either bald eagles or urban ecology. The urban bird communities of American cities have been assembling and stabilizing over more than a century in an environment without large native raptors as regular territory-holding residents. Peregrine falcons, which recovered earlier and colonized urban environments before bald eagles did, have produced documented effects on urban pigeon and starling populations. But peregrines are smaller, faster, more specialized, and less ecologically dominant than bald eagles, and their effects on urban bird communities, while real, are not equivalent to what a significant urban bald eagle population might produce. The urban waterbird communities of American rivers and urban water bodies, including the Canada goose populations that have become a management challenge in virtually every American city with significant park and water infrastructure. The cormorant and heron colonies that have established in urban greenways. The diving duck populations that winter on urban rivers and reservoirs are all potential components of the urban bald eagle's prey base. The degree to which eagle predation and eagle-induced behavioral changes in prey species will alter the composition and abundance of urban waterbird communities is an open empirical question. It is not a question with an obviously benign answer. Canada geese represent a particularly instructive case study in this context. The resident Canada goose population in the United States, meaning birds that do not migrate but live year-round in suburban and urban areas, grew from approximately 1 million birds in the 1990s to more than 4 million birds by the early 2020s. This population has become a significant management problem in parks, on golf courses, around airports, and on urban waterways across the country, and enormous public resources have been directed at controlling it through egg-addling, harassment programs, and lethal removal. Bald eagles are documented predators of Canada geese in natural settings, and there is genuine interest in some management quarters about whether eagle predation on urban geese will function as a natural population control. The answer to this question is not yet known with confidence. What is known is that eagle predation on Canada geese in urban settings does not operate under the same conditions as eagle predation in natural settings, where prey-flight distances, predator-prey spatial relationships, and habitat structure produce outcomes that fit existing predictive models. In urban parks and urban waterways, where geese have been behaviorally conditioned to low predation risk and where spatial constraints alter the hunting dynamics in ways that are site-specific and poorly characterized, the extent to which eagles will function as effective goose population regulators rather than as selective predators on the most vulnerable individuals is not established. The airport dimension of this story is one that the aviation safety community has been paying close attention to for longer than the public conversation about urban eagles has been running. Bird strikes, meaning collisions between aircraft and birds during takeoff and landing phases of flight, represent a significant and growing aviation safety concern in the United States. The Federal Aviation Administration's Wildlife Strike Database, which has been collecting voluntary reports since the 1990s, documents more than 17,000 wildlife strikes per year in recent years, the vast majority of which involve birds. The overwhelming majority of strikes are from small to medium-sized birds and produce damage that is costly but not catastrophic. A small proportion involve large birds, and these are the strikes with the potential for consequences at the catastrophic end of the spectrum, because large birds carry the mass and structural integrity to cause engine failure and airframe damage that small birds cannot. Bald eagles are, by a significant margin, the largest bird regularly encountered in the airspace around American airports. The engines of commercial aircraft are tested to withstand the ingestion of birds up to a specific mass, and the testing standards that apply reflect the bird size distributions historically encountered in airport environments. Bald eagles exceed those testing standards. A full-size bald eagle ingested by a turbofan engine during the critical low-altitude phase of takeoff or landing represents a category of strike event that is qualitatively different from the species that have historically dominated the wildlife strike record. The number of documented bald eagle strikes on aircraft has increased as the species population has grown and its range has expanded into urban and peri-urban areas adjacent to airports. The increase has been noted in the FAA database and has attracted the attention of wildlife biologists and aviation safety engineers. The management response at airports, which primarily involves habitat modification to reduce bird attractiveness around airport perimeters, was designed around the bird species historically present in airport environments and has not been systematically updated to account for the behavioral and ecological characteristics of a large, wide-ranging apex raptor that does not respond to the harassment techniques effective against gulls, starlings, and Canada geese. The broader question of what it means to have large apex predators adapting to urban environments faster than the institutions responsible for managing urban environments can adapt their frameworks to accommodate them is not unique to bald eagles. It is a feature of the current ecological moment in the United States, which is characterized by a suite of large vertebrate species, each driven by a different combination of population recovery, habitat change, and behavioral flexibility, expanding their ranges and behavioral repertoires into environments they did not historically occupy. Coyotes are now documented in every major American city. Black bears are foraging in suburban neighborhoods from New Jersey to California. White-tailed deer have reached population densities in suburban environments that exceed anything in their historical range. Mountain lions are pushing into the peri-urban edges of western cities, and now bald eagles are nesting in downtown Chicago. Each of these expansions is proceeding faster than the policy and management frameworks governing the species in question were built to accommodate, because those frameworks were built around historical distributions and historical behaviors that the current ecological conditions are making obsolete. The frameworks are not wrong exactly. They represent sophisticated and carefully developed responses to the conservation challenges that existed when they were designed. But they were designed for a world in which apex predators and large mammals were retreating from human environments, not expanding into them. The management assumptions, the monitoring infrastructure, the legal frameworks, and the public communication strategies were all optimized for a trajectory that has reversed. The reversal is, in important ways, a conservation success. The species recovering and adapting are recovering and adapting because the conservation interventions of the past half-century worked. But success at one scale has created challenges at another scale that the people and institutions responsible for managing these species are still working out how to address. The bald eagle's situation is particularly acute because the species occupies such a powerful symbolic position in American culture that even discussing the management challenges associated with its urban expansion feels, to many people, like an attack on a conservation icon. The bald eagle is the national symbol of the United States. Its image appears on the seal of the United States, on currency, on federal agency insignia, on military insignia, on the logos of institutions across American civic life. Its recovery from near extinction has been taught in American classrooms as a story of national redemption and environmental responsibility for 50 years. Suggesting that its urban expansion requires careful management and honest risk assessment rather than unqualified celebration is not an attack on any of that. But it runs against the emotional grain of the narrative strongly enough that scientists and wildlife managers who want to raise questions about urban eagle management in public forums have to calibrate their language with unusual care. The calibration is visible in the public statements that wildlife researchers have made in recent years about urban eagle behavior. The language is careful. The acknowledgements of ecological and safety concerns are real, but embedded in layers of affirmation of the species' conservation significance. The uncertainty about the trajectory of urban colonization is honestly stated, but rarely elevated to the prominence it warrants. Scientists who study this phenomenon are not hiding what they know. They are communicating it in a register designed to avoid triggering a cultural response that would overwhelm the scientific content of what they are trying to say. This is a completely understandable communication strategy, and a largely ineffective one, in the same way that the mountain lion management community's careful language around attack trends has produced public understanding of the risk landscape that lags substantially behind what the incident data actually shows. The legal framework governing bald eagles in the United States is the other major constraint on honest management discussion, and it is worth understanding in some detail because it explains a significant portion of why the gap between what scientists know and what managers can do is as large as it is. The Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act makes it a federal crime to take, possess, sell, purchase, barter, offer to sell, transport, export, or import any bald eagle alive or dead, including any part, nest, or egg of such an eagle, without a permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The criminal penalties for violation are substantial. The regulatory framework for permits is governed by a set of standards that were developed in the context of managing the species' recovery from endangered status, and that were not designed with urban nuisance or public safety management scenarios in mind. Managing a bald eagle nest that has been established on infrastructure where it creates safety risks, managing eagles that have habituated to the point of taking livestock or domestic animals, managing eagles whose territorial behavior in urban environments creates conflicts with human activity. All of these management actions operate within a legal framework that imposes significant constraints and requires federal involvement at a level of bureaucratic complexity that does not match the time sensitivity of some of the management needs it is supposed to address. The contrast with the management framework for species like coyotes, which receive no federal protection, can be lethally controlled without permits and are actively managed by federal animal damage control programs in contexts where they conflict with human interests, is stark and illustrative. Coyotes are managed with a degree of flexibility and speed that allows managers to respond to specific conflict situations at a pace that roughly matches the pace of those situations developing. Bald eagle management operates on a timeline determined by federal permit processing and by the strictness of the protections that the species' symbolic status has generated. This is not an argument for reducing eagle protections in general. It is an observation that the management framework appropriate for a species recovering from the edge of extinction, which is what the current framework was designed for, may not be the management framework appropriate for a species whose population has recovered to 316,000 individuals and that is now expanding its behavioral repertoire into environments its recovery programs did not anticipate. The nest site relocation question is where this legal constraint becomes most practically significant. When bald eagles establish a nest on infrastructure, a bridge, a cell tower, a building rooftop, a power transmission structure, in a location where the nest creates safety risks, structural concerns, or operational problems for the infrastructure it is built on, the management options available under the current legal framework are severely limited. Nests cannot be removed during the active breeding season without a federal permit that takes time to obtain and that may not be granted. Nests can sometimes be removed outside the breeding season under specific permit conditions, but if the birds have established site fidelity, removal of the nest does not necessarily prevent the pair from returning and attempting to rebuild. The birds themselves cannot be moved without extensive federal involvement. The practical result in many documented cases has been that infrastructure managers have been forced to work around active eagle nests on their structures for multiple breeding seasons while navigating the permit process, incurring costs and operational disruptions that the legal framework does not have a systematic mechanism for addressing. This is not a hypothetical problem. It is a documented one, with specific cases in multiple states, and it is a problem that will become more common and more operationally significant as urban eagle colonization continues. The bridges, power structures, and other infrastructure elements that eagles find attractive for nesting in urban environments are often critical operational infrastructure whose managers have neither the ecological expertise nor the legal framework familiarity to navigate the permitting complexity that eagle presence imposes on them. The gap between the management needs of urban eagle colonization and the tools available to address those needs is not being closed at a rate proportionate to the pace at which urban eagle populations are growing. What needs to happen, and what is not happening at the speed that the situation warrants, is a systematic reconfiguration of the monitoring, management, and communication frameworks surrounding bald eagles to account for what the species actually is in 2024, as opposed to what it was in 1980, when the frameworks were built. The monitoring infrastructure that tracks eagle population status and behavior was designed to document recovery in natural habitats and assess the response of eagles to conservation interventions in the environments where the species had historically lived. It was not designed to track the behavioral dynamics of an expanding urban population, to capture the prey-switching behavior that urban-adapted eagles exhibit, to monitor the rate of nest establishment on urban infrastructure, or to measure the frequency and severity of eagle-human and eagle-domestic animal interactions in densely populated environments. Building that monitoring infrastructure requires acknowledging that urban eagle colonization is a management challenge as well as a conservation success, and that acknowledgement is politically difficult in the current cultural context around the species. The public communication piece is perhaps the most urgently needed and most straightforwardly achievable change available. The coverage of urban eagle presence that currently reaches American audiences is almost uniformly positive, celebratory, and devoid of behavioral context that would help urban residents understand how to coexist safely with eagles that have established territories in their neighborhoods. Small pet owners in urban areas adjacent to documented eagle territories are not being advised about the behavioral cues that indicate predatory interest by an eagle, about how to modify outdoor pet supervision practices in response to eagle presence, or about what to do when an eagle strikes. Parents of young children in urban parks adjacent to eagle nest sites are not receiving information about nest defense behavior and the distance within which eagle defensive strikes have been documented. Birders and photographers who approach eagle nest sites for photography and who do so in urban environments where the approach distances that would be obviously inappropriate in natural settings feel counterintuitively acceptable amid the general human activity of the city are not being systematically informed about the nest defense intensity of urban adapted eagles or the injury potential of close approach defensive strikes. None of this information is secret. It is documented in the scientific literature, known to the researchers and managers working with urban eagle populations, and readily derivable from the behavioral ecology of the species. It is simply not being communicated to the public in the systematic and accessible way that the current urban eagle colonization trend warrants. The communication gap is partly a function of institutional risk aversion about saying anything that might dampen the public enthusiasm for a beloved conservation icon. It is partly a function of the genuine uncertainty about the trajectory of urban eagle populations and the management challenges they will produce. It is partly a function of the fragmentation of wildlife management authority in urban environments, where county, state, and federal jurisdictions overlap in ways that diffuse responsibility for public information about specific species. And it is partly a function of the simple institutional tendency to communicate about wildlife in ways that generate public support for conservation, rather than public anxiety about specific species, which are understandable motivations that produce a specific and predictable distortion in the accuracy of the information reaching the people who need it. The honest version of the urban eagle story, the version that the scientists working most carefully with the data would tell if they were not constrained by the political and institutional pressures that shape public wildlife communication, would sound something like this. The bald eagle's recovery is among the most significant conservation achievements of the past century, and it is worth recognizing and celebrating for exactly the reasons that have been articulated for decades. The population growth that makes urban colonization possible is a direct result of conservation interventions that were designed well and implemented effectively, and those interventions should be sustained and strengthened. At the same time, a population of 316,000 eagles is a population that exists in a fundamentally different ecological situation than a population of 500 nesting pairs, and the management frameworks appropriate for 500 pairs are not automatically appropriate for 316,000 individuals, particularly when a growing subset of those individuals is adapting to urban environments in ways that create specific and identifiable risks and challenges that the existing frameworks were not built to address. Updating those frameworks is not a betrayal of the species or its conservation legacy. It is the logical and necessary next step in managing a successful recovery that has produced a new set of challenges by virtue of its success. The trajectory of urban eagle colonization in the United States over the next 2 decades will be determined by decisions that are being made right now, some intentionally and some by default. Whether the monitoring infrastructure to track urban eagle populations, behavior, and conflict incidents is built or not is a decision. Whether the legal framework governing eagle management is updated to include provisions specifically calibrated to urban conflict scenarios is a decision. Whether wildlife agencies develop and disseminate public communication about coexistence with urban eagles that includes honest information about risks alongside celebration of the species' presence is a decision. Whether urban planning and infrastructure management agencies develop protocols for eagle nest site management that integrate ecological knowledge with operational needs is a decision. Whether the scientific community studying urban eagle colonization is provided with the funding and institutional support to build the knowledge base that all of these other decisions need to be based on is a decision. All of these decisions are currently being made, mostly by default, mostly in favor of the status quo communication and management approach, in an environment where the population and behavioral trends they need to address are moving faster than the institutional response. The bald eagle did not nearly go extinct because of malice. It went extinct because the institutions and incentive structures of the time did not account for the ecological consequences of decisions being made at scale. DDT was not introduced with the intent of eliminating bald eagles. It was introduced because it was effective at killing insects, and because the framework within which the decision to use it was made did not require a serious accounting of its effects on the aquatic food chains that large raptors depended on. The lesson of the eagle's near extinction is not only that conservation works when it is applied deliberately and scientifically, which is true, it is also that ecological consequences of scale can emerge from decisions made in the absence of ecological accounting, and that the gap between what is happening in the natural world and what the responsible institutions understand to be happening is where the most consequential and irreversible changes tend to occur. That lesson applies to the current situation. The bald eagle is not threatened by its urban expansion. It is thriving through it. What is threatened by the gap between what is happening with urban eagles and what the public, the management institutions, and the legal framework governing the species understand to be happening is something more diffuse, but not less important. It is the quality of coexistence between a recovering apex predator and the human communities it is moving into. It is the ecological integrity of urban and peri-urban environments that are being altered by the arrival of a large apex predator in ways that existing models cannot fully predict. It is the safety of specific categories of people and domestic animals that the current public communication framework is not equipping to make informed decisions about the risks they face. And it is the credibility of wildlife communication institutions that will be damaged, as it has been damaged in the mountain lion context, if the gap between what they know and what they say grows wide enough that the public notices it when an incident occurs that the reassuring language was not calibrated to predict. The bird on that rooftop in Chicago is genuinely magnificent. The story of how it got there is genuinely worth celebrating, and the full story of what its presence there means, ecologically, legally, managerially, and in terms of what it tells us about the trajectory of wildlife recovery in 21st century America, is more complicated and more important than the version that has been told so far. That story deserves to be told honestly, with the same precision and the same willingness to hold difficult facts alongside encouraging ones, that the science of the eagle's recovery was built on. The bird earned that honesty through 4 centuries of human persecution and 50 years of human rescue. The least we can do is look at it clearly,